Look at this landscape. An endless, scorched desert, so blistering hot you can see the air shimmer with heat. But you know what? Right now, you're actually looking at a river. Or rather at a project that's about to be called an engineering marvel, and at the same time, it's going to change the life of an entire country forever. What's the catch? The thing is, the water is underground, and the project is about building the world's largest artificial river right in the middle of the desert. Saudi Arabia is planning to pour tons of fresh water into the desert, and it's up to us to figure out what's going to come of it. Meanwhile, I'll pour myself some coffee. Just an unobtrusive reminder to do something under the video in case you sometimes forget. And thanks to those who, well, you know what for. Let's kick things off with a story, and a pretty recent one. For the past 3 decades, Saudi Arabia has been drilling wells in search of a resource more valuable than oil. Yes, we're talking about fresh water. Engineers and farmers extracted its hidden reserves to grow grain, fruits, and vegetables in the middle of the desert, and it's no wonder as rain here is scarce or completely absent and there are no rivers or lakes. For centuries, whether through oasis or desalination plants, Saudis have managed to find enough water for their everyday needs. But not so long ago, nationwide efforts changed the desert, and now they need even more water. The Saudi scenery now has farmland brought to life by underground water. Massive buildings next to the fields house tens of thousands of dairy cows that rely on cooling and water. Like I said, this water's pumped from underground from aquifers that filled up thousands of years ago, back when the climate in Saudi Arabia was a lot wetter. Back in the 1970s, the government made a big effort to find such aquifers and figure out how much water they could hold. Then it drilled tens of thousands of deep wells in areas with the best potential for urban and agricultural use. But since then, a lot has changed. In fact, Saudi Arabia's water sector has seen just as massive transformations as the rest of the country, and one of the key players in this shift has been a company turning seawater into fresh water. Up until 1994, water use in Saudi Arabia was totally free for households, and it was only after that they decided to introduce a small, modest fee. But the fee was really minimal, so with generous government subsidies for water, the country quickly expanded its irrigated areas. In 1980, the volume of water consumed in the country was about 2 trillion gallons, and by 1994, this amount had almost tripled. The figure reached 5 trillion gallons. This is what irrigation canals look like in Saudi Arabia, delivering fresh water from deep wells and desalination plants to farms and homes. These are literally rivers running through the desert. In modern Saudi Arabia, there are basically 2 sources of water for the population: the sea, which is desalinated, and deep wells. The country uses twice as much water per person as the world average, 69 gallons per person per day. And this number's increasing due to climate change. For a country that's in the middle of a desert, this is especially concerning, because the water is running out. When intensive modern farming first began, there was an astonishing 132 trillion gallons of water under the desert of Saudi Arabia, enough to fill Lake Erie in the U.S. But every year, 5.5 trillion gallons of water were pumped out of there, and that could only end badly, because the aquifers mostly replenish through rain, and it hardly ever rains. As a result, the Saudis have gone down a path that led them to use at least 105 trillion gallons of their aquifers by 2008. That is, 4/5 of the underground water in Saudi Arabia has been used. This means that one of the largest and oldest freshwater resources on the planet, and one of the hottest and driest places, was almost drained in just 1 generation. One of the groundwater experts in Saudi Arabia predicted back in 2016 that there would only be enough water left in the kingdom for another 13 years. A truly alarming trend. To understand how the country's attitude towards water has changed, you can look at this graph. After 2015, total consumption started to decrease because less water was used in agriculture. The drop is especially noticeable after 2019, when the government program to reduce feed crop production started. In March 2019, the WATOP program was launched, requiring citizens to drastically cut water consumption. Its goal is to limit water use to 53 gallons per person per day by 2020 and to 40 gallons by 2030. That's 26 gallons less than was used before. Back in 2000, the Saudi Arabian government took steps to reduce water consumption by cutting subsidies. At the same time, the population was encouraged to use water-saving technologies like drip irrigation and soil moisture measurement tools. This, well, kind of helped. At least it led to the gradual decline of the wheat farming industry, from producing 4 million tons in 1992 to 1.8 million tons in 2000. By 2016, production had stopped. Today, about 50% of drinking water comes from desalination plants, 40% from extracting non-renewable groundwater, and only 10% from surface water in the mountainous southwest of the country. But the problem hasn't gone away. Even though Saudi Arabia's agriculture uses drip irrigation and hydroponics, which increase water efficiency, it's still not enough. And that's when it appears. The largest artificial river in the world. The plan involves digging a channel that'll stretch 7,500 miles long, 36 feet wide, and 13 feet deep. The goal of all this is to surpass the Nile, and surpass it for sure. The famous Egyptian river is 4,130 miles long. This ambitious project will require the use of corrosion-resistant pipes, each with a diameter of 7.4 feet, and people plan to transport fresh water through them from one place to another. If the project is completed, this network will become one of the largest in the world because it won't just be one river. The pipes laid under Saudi cities will stretch for 78,300 miles, enough to wrap around the world 3 times at the equator. The amount of water passing through the rivers would be such that if it were spread out among the world's population, everyone would get 2 gallons. If you're wondering why rivers need to be channeled underground, whether in Libya or Saudi Arabia, the answer is simple: temperature. Summers in Saudi Arabia are incredibly hot and dry. The temperature ranges from 81 degrees Fahrenheit to 109 degrees Fahrenheit in the inland areas, and from 81 degrees Fahrenheit to 100 degrees Fahrenheit on the coast. As I've said before, the rainfall situation isn't any better. In most areas, the annual amount doesn't exceed 6 inches throughout the year, except for the southwestern part, where 16 to 24 inches of rain fall annually. Although water evaporation is a natural process, it can happen at different speeds depending on the weather conditions. In Saudi Arabia, this speed is really high. That's why, along with the extremely low amount of rainfall, the kingdom is one of the driest countries in the world. That's why it's a pretty smart idea to hide the water underground away from the sun, heat, and wind. Just try to protect this precious resource from evaporation as well as any other harmful effects. The project is really important for the country. Saudi Arabia's economy heavily depends on the oil sector. In recent years, oil has accounted for about 40% of Saudi Arabia's GDP. The kingdom ranks second in proven oil reserves and fourth in proven natural gas reserves, plus it's the largest oil exporter in the world. Other key sectors of the economy include oil refining and chemical production based on oil reserves. And for a long time, this was a perfectly working scheme that ensured the country's prosperity. In 2022, its oil export revenues were $311 billion. That's almost 3 times more than Iraq and the UAE, who are in second and third place, and dozens of times more than all other countries. Oil makes Saudi Arabia incredibly rich. However, the world's changing, and it's currently on the path to gradually moving away from oil and gas. If it doesn't adjust to these changes, the country's economy could end up in a very vulnerable position. Understanding this, in 2016, the Saudi Arabian government launched the Saudi Vision 2030 program aimed at reducing dependence on oil and diversifying economic resources. However, by 2022, the country had only achieved modest results. But if Saudi Arabia has unlimited drinking water, it'll give the country hope of reaching its long-awaited goal, feeding itself instead of importing food from other countries. And of course, the country will stop depending on oil. Today, imports cover 80% of Saudi Arabia's food needs. Only 20% of food is produced locally. This is actually a common situation in countries with dry climates. On average, the countries of the Gulf Cooperation Council import 90% of their food from other countries. For example, Qatar imports as much as 97%, followed by Bahrain with 92%, and Kuwait imports 91%. So Saudi Arabia is actually doing fairly well. But food prices have been going up lately, so it's really important for the country to start producing food on its own. They'll have to start with water, which they'll get straight from the sea. Desalination is a dependable water source that doesn't rely on rainfall. They take seawater, remove the salt and impurities, and end up with drinking water. There are two desalination processes, and the first one is reverse osmosis. First, seawater is pumped into the desalination plant and undergoes pre-filtration to remove most of the particles. Usually, the intake pipes are located at the bottom of the sea, far from shore. The flow speed of the seawater entering the intake tunnel is quite low, less than 3 feet per second, and much slower than the ocean currents in the area. This allows the local marine life to swim out of the tunnel and avoid getting into the plant. So the already filtered seawaters pass through special membranes under high pressure. The pores in the membranes are so tiny that salt, bacteria, viruses, and all sorts of super tiny impurities are separated from the water. Basically, these membranes work like microscopic filters. As a result of the reverse osmosis process, about half of the water that comes into the plant from the sea turns into fresh water. The salt and impurities removed from it are then returned to the ocean through diffusers. This ensures quick mixing of the saline concentrate so it doesn't affect the marine environment. After that, the purified water is treated to meet drinking water standards. Unlike reverse osmosis, which uses semi-permeable membranes to filter out salt and other impurities, the multi-stage flash distillation method works by changing temperature and pressure. The term flash refers to rapid evaporation caused by a sharp drop in pressure, and this process is repeated at different stages. Hence, that's basically where the name comes from. At each stage, salty water is exposed to steam heat and reduced pressure. This causes part of the water to quickly evaporate or flash into steam, which is essentially fresh water. The remaining salty solution is called brine. In general, if we simplify the whole process, it's about evaporating salty water to get fresh steam. Everything else is just details. And it's also important to mention that Saudi Arabia is already the world leader in desalinated water production. The country produces over 264 billion gallons per year, which makes up 18% of the global output. This is mainly thanks to the Saline Water Conversion Corporation, a state-controlled organization that's basically responsible for fresh water. The desalination plants of the corporation, located on the East Coast, produce 130 billion gallons of water, while the coastal stations produce 135 billion gallons. These two regions together account for a total of 264 billion gallons of water per year. In addition, 27 desalination plants operating in the country generate a total of 24,884,807 megawatt-hours of electricity. Quite a nice bonus. However, despite its leading position in desalination, Saudi Arabia is facing challenges. For obvious reasons, desalinating seawater has long been considered the solution to the increasing risk of water shortages in the Middle East. However, the industry involves high energy consumption. In 2016, desalination made up 3% of the Middle East's water supply, but 5% of its energy costs. Turning seawater into fresh water is really costly. They even estimated that desalinating seawater takes 4 times more energy than collecting groundwater. Moreover, desalination plants harm the environment by releasing pollutants into the air and threatening marine ecosystems with their waste. I said that efforts are made to minimize this damage, but it still persists, and the ecology of our planet is already in bad shape. But if desalination is that bad, with so many downsides, how is the country planning to turn an incredible amount of water into fresh water for the underground artificial river? It's simple. It'll use the sun. This sounds like a plan suitable for desert dwellers. Desalinate water with sunlight. Well, almost. Saudi Arabia became the first country to launch a commercial solar-powered desalination plant. WATOP is the world's largest desalination project using solar energy, providing the region with water in an innovative and, most importantly, sustainable way. Launched back in 2018, the desalination plant in WATOP is a groundbreaking system that turns salty water into clean drinking water and generates clean energy for the kingdom. The capacity is quite impressive. Up to 24 million gallons of pure water a day. Thanks to this plant, it's been possible to cut down on crude oil consumption and reduce CO2 emissions into the atmosphere. In recent years, the use of renewable energy sources like solar power to run desalination plants has become a top priority. It makes sense, plus it aligns with what the rest of the world is doing, and Saudi Arabia definitely doesn't want to be left behind in anything. The biggest news in the past few days is that I finally got a good sleep. At last. Profitable energy. By the way, a few more words about solar energy. In Saudi Arabia, electricity generated this way has dropped to its lowest cost, making solar power even more accessible to a wider range of consumers. Moreover, on June 6, 2024, it was announced that the country set a new world record for the lowest cost of electricity generated from solar photovoltaic sources. 1 megawatt hour cost $10.40. And in fact, this is not surprising, as Saudi Arabia has everything needed for green energy to spread widely and cheaply. Key factors include favorable economic conditions, attractive investment opportunities, the lowering cost of solar panel components, and low labor costs. And yes, don't forget about the climate. Saudi Arabia simply has enough sun to produce solar power. And the country, of course, has no plans of stopping with this achievement. It's expected that by 2030, Saudi Arabia will be in the top 3 leaders in solar energy capacity. Forecasts predict that by the middle of the 21st century, renewable energy sources, including water, solar, and wind power, will account for up to 70% of the energy production mix in the Middle East. This is a significant increase compared to the current 5% recorded by the end of 2023, and it's hard not to be pleased about that. What did the other 95% consist of? Of course, it was fossil fuels. Yes, natural gas and oil are playing a key role in the economy right now, but all resources eventually run out. That's why Saudi Arabia is thinking about the future, and starting from 2030, everything will change. The wrong rivers. Now let's get back to the topic of water in Saudi Arabia and see if there's anything else interesting there. And there really is. In this country, rivers flow the other way around. Literally, the rivers start from the sea and rise up to the mountains. Of course, this wouldn't be possible without human help. But how many places do you know where you can see something like that? We're talking about a unique infrastructure featuring massive pipelines that stretch across the country to distribute desalinated water. They even earned a spot in the Guinness World Records as the largest water distribution system in the world. And it's totally deserved, since the total length of the pipelines is over 8,700 miles. And that's just the pipelines. The whole water distribution system covers more than 81,000 miles. Meanwhile, the water collection network spans over 31,000 miles. Because of this extensive network, even far-off areas can develop, relying on plentiful and affordable water resources. Sounds pretty innovative. Borrowed water. No matter how impressive the water desalination projects are in Saudi Arabia, it's still not enough. So the country, let's say, makes use of someone else's water. Since 2014, a Saudi Arabian company called Fondomonte has been tapping into underground water in the desert west of Phoenix, Arizona. Naturally, this has raised concerns among the local population. A study conducted by Arizona Central revealed that the company Fondomonte has a unique advantage. By paying just $25 for 1 acre per year, it has the right to use local water resources without restrictions. These terms are several times more favorable than those of local farmers, so why not take advantage of them? Yes, it's incredibly beneficial, but according to the locals, the state's water should be used only for the benefit of Arizona residents, not some foreign companies. Wait a minute. What's a company from Saudi Arabia even doing in the U.S.? The thing is, Fondomonte has been actively acquiring land in the southwest of the U.S. to grow alfalfa. Hundreds of thousands of acres in Arizona are already owned by the company, and recently they expanded their operations to eastern California. What does the U.S. government say in response to the protests by local people? Well, the Arizona State Land Department, which leased the land of the company Fondomonte, is silent about how much water is being extracted. This is exactly what's raising concerns about the possible depletion of groundwater, which, by the way, is quite justified. Saudi Arabia itself ran into trouble with depleting underground water supplies due to uncontrolled water withdrawal. Research from 2004 showed that the kingdom's water resources were nearly drained after big landowners used artisan wells for 30 years without limits. As of now, around half of the water used in the country is produced at desalination plants, a process that involves heavy costs and energy. This is why Saudi Arabia reached out to the U.S. with a mutually beneficial offer, which sparks plenty of questions and controversies. Toxin problem. I just said that Saudi Arabia is doing a good job and setting an example for other countries, but there's also a lot of bad stuff going on in this country. The world's top oil exporter is just polluting everything around it. As I've mentioned before, the desalination plants providing water to the kingdom produce a huge amount of waste, which contains chemicals and threatens to contaminate the food chains. Just think about it. Every day, Saudi Arabia releases 1.1 billion cubic feet of waste in the form of concentrated brine, which poses a serious environmental threat. And by the way, there are about 16,000 such plants operating worldwide. Their combined waste could cover an area the size of Florida with a 12-inch layer of toxic brine every year. And that's just awful. But where do all these waste products come from if essentially salt water is just being turned into fresh water? The thing is, the conversion process leads to the creation of wastewater contaminated with chemicals like chlorine and copper. According to the UN, for every 0.3 gallons of fresh water produced, about 0.4 gallons of polluted brine is generated. Usually all of this is dumped into the ocean, but you understand that it doesn't go without consequences, right? Such actions lower the oxygen levels in the water and have a negative impact on living organisms. So all we can do is hope that scientists will do research and figure out how to turn the problem into an economic opportunity. Although I really doubt anyone needs polluted water. You owe me an unobtrusive like. See you later.